Welcome to the next edition of Grid Pulse. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we are going to uncover a dynamic topic that we've been chatting about for some time, the role of aggregated resources on the grid, but it really feels like we're at an interesting inflection point. So we're going to dive in. We've got three amazing folks with us: Jeff Quigley from Virtual Peaker, Madeline Turner from Ohm Analytics, and Kevin Joyce from Tesla. Thank you all for being on.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Looking forward to it.
So we're going to jump in. I know we've got three of you all on here, so we'll do very quick introductions. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you into your current role. And Jeff, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. And thanks for having me on. I'm Jeff Quigley. I've been at Virtual Peaker for about 8 years. I joined the company back when we were a pretty small organization doing a couple of small pilots. Now we've matured into working with about 40 utilities across North America, different capacities, which we'll talk about later. Prior to that, I've played different roles in the energy space, did some work in consulting, worked for a few other startups and software companies. So yeah, excited to be with you all today.
Thanks for being on, Jeff. Madeline, we'll have you next.
Thanks for having me on, Bryce. I'm Madeline. I'm a policy and research analyst with Ohm. I've been at Ohm Analytics for about 2 years now, and it's my first foray into the energy industry. And for, the last 8 years, Ohm has really served as a source of truth for market intelligence on the distributed generation industry. So, covering the rise of virtual power plants and the aggregation of these different DERs was a natural, progression of the work that we do covering the industry. And I'm really excited to talk about, where things are going.
And last up, Kevin with the little-known company Tesla. Kevin, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, happy to be here. So hi, I'm Kevin Joyce. I'm our global lead for virtual power plants and retail electricity plants. Been with Tesla for 10 years now, and have been working in virtual power plants and load flexibility that whole time. So that's from our early programs, doing distribution feeders in California and launching Green Mountain Power to today when we're aggregating 250,000 Powerwall systems and VPPs, 1.6 gigawatts. So it's been really fun seeing it scale and to get where we are.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. And Kevin, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind getting us into the conversation here. Let's talk a little bit about the main drivers. What's happening on the grid? Why do we need more flexibility?
Well, we're very focused on just affordability, like everyone is in the utility space right now. There are a lot of challenges putting pressure on rates right now, right? There's the need for extra capacity with load growth returning. There's the need to control distribution spend. All of these things are putting unwelcome pressure on utility rates. And I'm particularly excited because VPPs are kind of a right down the middle solution to all of these problems. It's part of the all of the above kind of solution that we need. It's a capacity resource when capacity is scarce. It's a grid edge resource when, so much of utility spend is going into the distribution side of the business, the delivery side of the business. And VPPs are uniquely positioned in order to provide the services and control costs on exactly that, to drive up utilization on the distribution system.
Anything to add on that dynamic, Jeff, as we talk about just what the overall industry is seeing on the grid?
Yeah, I think Kevin nailed it, but one of the things I'll add is, looking back over the last, 8 years, obviously the cost of capacity and affordability has always been a core focus, but just the ramping of it's become so acute in the last, 18 months. It's always been a structural challenge. And I think a lot of utilities have been looking forward, thinking, hey, this is going to be a challenge in the future. And I think now it's here. And I think now that urgency, I think, is a really somewhat new and exciting dynamic for VPPs.
Madeline, when we think about the growth that the VPP space has seen, maybe you can share a little bit about research that you guys are doing, and if it's concentrated in some particular locations. It would be great to hear, how much of this resource is coming onto the system.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. In 2025, we saw total enrolled capacity in virtual power plants grow 21% year over year versus 10% year over year growth in 2024. So 2025 was a really impressive growth year, and I think we're well positioned to see that trend continue. And, the vast majority of that is still made up of this kind of more traditional C&I demand response. But some of the most impressive growth occurred in these really new, really interesting, really innovative segments. So residential battery enrollments jumped 153% year over year to just over 2 gigawatts. That was the fastest growing segment across all of the technologies that we covered in our report, followed by EV managed charging programs, which grew 122% year over year. So I think this really highlights that there's been a shift towards these more advanced multi-device programs. Smart thermostat growth plateaued at about 4% year over year growth. So we're really seeing that torch pass to storage.
Kevin, Jeff, anything to add on this?
I think Madeline highlighted one of the biggest, most important transitions, and that's towards more advanced load flexibility technologies. The inverter-based resources, things like power walls, things like vehicle to grid, these have capabilities that traditional demand response haven't had all along. And that's one of the challenges that we have facing us, is we have to push through preconceptions that people have in terms of what load flexibility can actually do. VPPs are doing the advanced services. We've been doing regulation in ISO New England since 2020 with Powerwalls. We've been SCED integrated in ERCOT since we launched Tesla Electric soon after Winter Storm Uri. And there are other players that are taking advantage of this, leading with market integrated kinds of programs. And I think that trend is going to continue. That's certainly something that we're interested in continuing to pursue.
Well, Jeff, continuing on that thread, as far as what these aggregated resources are doing, in reality, what are we achieving as they're coming onto the system?
Well, I think that the evolution of the asset classes and types is really changing sort of the way that they show up and how they're being utilized. I think this all of the above sort of mindset that we've had for quite some time, certainly at Virtual Peaker, I think has, allowed us to get to scale and then evolve into sort of these different types of expressions of capacity. So what I mean by that is, you have sort of smart thermostats being this, long-standing, at least on the residential side, aggregated resource, primarily just because that's what's out there and that's what's available to dispatch. And we've seen varying degrees of success in different markets. And, in some places, especially like, Texas, where it gets incredibly hot, you can see immense savings on these types of programs. But like Kevin and Madeline are saying, the evolution to more inverter-based dispatch is giving us, as a company, more flexibility to dispatch them in more interesting and unique ways, bidirectionally or more localized dispatch opportunities. So I think that in terms of scale, we see programs all across the board. Some still small in the piloting stage, some in the more mature, tens of thousands or above at that level. But overall, I think that the more diverse the set of assets under control, the more flexibility I think it gives utilities and other stakeholders to meet those different use cases.
Maybe scaled deployments, Kevin, that you would want to highlight, that give us a different perspective on the sorts of value that they're bringing to the system?
The two big examples that I can think of, the first one is got to be California last year. There was a 500 megawatt test event in California last year, demonstrated capacity of that much. These programs that created that much capacity pulled it together in 2.5, 3 years. You can't build a natural gas combined cycles worth of capacity in California any other way these days. The other big, super exciting example from the last year or so is the massive growth in Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Rico is a unique case in terms of the actual need, in terms of the capacity crisis that they have in that island, where load shed is a routine fact of life for utility customers. Responding to that crisis, many aggregators rapidly expanded that program. And as a consequence, have been able to create a very reliable VPP resource on that island. So reliable, in fact, that, unofficially more than 10 times last summer, the fact that there was megawatts, tens of megawatts of VPP capacity dispatching on the island allowed LUMA, the island utility, to avoid the need for load shed. So it's a really exciting story. You can draw a straight line between the fact that this VPP is a reliable resource on the island to the fact that non-participating customers are not having their utility service shut off. So, one customer buys a resiliency solution, and the consequence is another customer has greater resiliency. It's a wonderful success story, in addition to being a proof point of scaled reliable capacity.
Yeah, and on that topic of benefits to everybody, not just the participating customers, Madeline, as far as latent capacity, how much resource is showing up in these programs?
From our research, we know that around 40% of all deployed residential batteries across the US and in Puerto Rico are actually enrolled in a VPP. And so think about the headroom for growth that exists with just enrolling devices already on the grid. And the thing is, we're seeing storage continue to take off at a really healthy growth rate over the next 5 years as more folks turn to this for, as Kevin was saying, backup reasons, resiliency reasons. They want it for the grid services. They want it to retrofit their solar system, et cetera. So, as we move into 2030 and we're projecting to see over 30 gigawatt hours of new storage come on the system from, standalones, retrofits, and these PV paired systems. If we can enroll what's already existing and what's already out there, we're going to see the capacity just continue to take off.
Most operators in North America had forecasts of maybe 0.5% growth, just even a handful of months, let alone years ago. And it might not sound like a lot, but it's pretty tectonic if they're shifting that 10x to 5%. And we're kind of seeing that sort of number in a lot of jurisdictions. I'll have you, Jeff, start with this. How does a flexible resource, like these aggregated distributed resources that we're talking about, help to meet that delta?
Yeah, I think Kevin kind of touched on this earlier, but the first element is speed to availability. I think that a lot of the growth that we're seeing, to your point, is sort of catching utilities somewhat off guard. And so I think that that's requiring a sort of rapid response. And I think that as we start to think about what it would take, even if steel was put into the ground today, how long it would take to sort of actually realize additional capacity, I think it's creating this perfect storm where standing up a VPP provides sort of a number of different value props, speed, as well as the ability to kind of diversify the location of those different assets. The ability to enroll customers in different parts of the grid. It's creating not just sort of the overall sort of system load growth, but it's also creating these pockets of intense demand growth that's creating what I would argue are somewhat unexpected constraints.
Kevin, maybe you can add on here. The analogy I say is we're kind of planting and shifting sand, it feels like these days. Everything seems to be moving around, but is there a reason that these aggregated VPPs are an especially good tool in these dynamics?
Well, you're absolutely right about there being, shifting sands and everything, and it's going to be a situation where all solutions are going to be needed in order to close the gap. We're in a great position in terms of being able to see the growth and see the opportunity. Madeline made an excellent point in terms of, there's a massive installed base already of power walls out there, of vehicles out there with bidirectional capability. But we're excited to see the growth. We have lease offers for our customers. We're seeing growth and adoption. We announced 1 million power walls installed globally just a few months ago.
Congratulations.
We're 30% beyond that already. So yes, it's about the installed capacity, but it's also about the ability to get more capacity in the ground and get it in faster. And in the DER space, things are accelerating. And there is capacity on the distribution system. And so it's an exciting part of the overall solution.
Madeline, anything to add on the shifting forecasts topic?
Yeah, just to build on what was already said, we know that this is tied to the rise of, data centers and all these other things that are, causing real affordability concerns. And just to kind of echo Jeff, we know these resources are already out there, less than 40, around 40% are currently enrolled. And getting those enrolled in a program up and running will happen a lot faster than putting steel on the ground and getting a new, peaker plant built. So it just seems like a win-win.
Maybe we can dive a little deeper in particular on the storage aspect of the VPP. I know we've talked some about it today. Kevin, you alluded to some of the power quality value areas that it's been providing for, more than a handful of years. With regards to aggregated storage in these VPPs, what are we achieving when it's coming into the system?
One of the chief concerns that grid operators tend to have is the predictability of that load. So if, what is the shape? What is the actual, is it going to look like a power plant when it shows up? And so we've developed a lot of technology over the last several years, including what we call top-line demand control, to make hardware that's installed show up in a more predictable fashion, and we've dispatched that in Lumen multiple times. We're also using that technology in a number of different utility programs as well. So I think that as we start to think about like what the reliability of that capacity looks like, we're sort of trying to bridge sort of the physical availability of the resource with how can we utilize software to kind of make it interchangeable with other forms of capacity.
And Kevin, maybe over to you, using the analogy of superheroes here. What are the superpowers of storage? Obviously it's fast, but what's its kryptonite? Because it does degrade and it does have certain duration limitations. So why storage, and why the sort of technologies that you guys have been deploying?
It's a very powerful grid resource, energy storage, of course. And there's nothing about being part of a virtual power plant. There's nothing about it being in someone's home that degrades that capability. There's nothing that a front of the meter, large scale battery energy storage system can do that a behind the meter VPP system can't do also. It's really about just creating those pathways and breaking down the barriers in order to allow it to provide that service. And goodness knows we have enough need out there to support the effort.
And I know each program is going to be unique, but are a lot of the resources showing up most days? Are you discharging them pretty deep into the battery? How do people recharge? Just a few of those maybe types of more technical things, if you could just give a few examples, Kevin, and then maybe Jeff, if you want to dive into.
Sure. I think this comes back to some of the points that we were making earlier in terms of load flexibility has transitioned to this more capable resource. And so some of the things that people expect out of a load flexibility and demand response resource in terms of customer fatigue and a certain amount of expected unreliability event to event, you really don't see that emerge with inverter-based virtual power plants. One of the most venerable programs, long-established programs right now is the Connected Solutions program in New England. It's been providing day in, day out capacity in that market since, I think 2018. And what we see in that market is that even though this is dispatched 60 times a summer, most non-holiday weekdays, it's an extremely reliable resource, hitting the same numbers day after day, the only difference being whether the grid operator needs a 2-hour event or a 3-hour event. Customers have a certain amount of, they do have agency over their systems. They can opt out. They can change their preferences. But we see engagement with that actually being very low. It's important. The customers value it highly, but use it rarely. Far less than 5% of people are opting out, and it's very consistent. And so you really can build a reliable capacity resource on this sort of thing. And that's the direction things are going. And in fact, it's become so reliable that that's the frontier, is companies like Tesla starting to get comfortable guaranteeing this value both for customers and for potential off-takers of capacity.
Jeff, anything to add, or did we cover it mostly there?
I think the only thing I'd add is that when we get engaged with a utility or somebody who's going to be participating in some kind of VPP program, usually we focus on the different stacks of value or parts of the value stack that we can provide. And I think generally speaking, the event-based dispatch is sort of the core. Doing that, like Kevin was saying, dozens of times during the course of a season is very, very common. We're also seeing these very much more frequent, like almost daily sort of short dispatch events. So maybe 15 or 30 minutes of batteries have that flexibility to respond to things like pricing signals and others. So almost like an energy arbitrage against rapid changes in price. So we are doing that in a number of different markets, including ERCOT and ISO New England. And then we also seen some rate-based sort of responsive dispatch, almost like a daily the shift. So we're seeing some utilities thinking, as they think about time of use rates and other areas, how can they actually help the customer benefit their own pocketbooks? I think that obviously being able to dispatch for capacity at the utility level is important, but some customers are actually buying these resources and are looking for assistance in determining, okay, how can they utilize them most effectively? So I would say daily dispatch for time of use or otherwise, arbitrage, and then sort of the traditional event-based dispatch are all in market at varying levels today with our programs.
So a bit of a shameless plug. Our main event this year is focused on grid affordability as we modernize the grid. And I think it was maybe the first comment we had in our conversation today. So glad to think back on that. Madeline, as we talk about the sort of scale that we're getting with these aggregated distributed resource programs, how are you all seeing the impact to the pressure that has been very much showing up for rates here in North America and frankly beyond?
Yeah, great question, Bryce. I mean, in 2025, we tracked over 75 major electric rate cases, so increases of 5% or more. We know that across the U.S., rates rose at about 6%, but in some states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they saw double-digit increases for, residential and C&I rates just due to those same things we were talking about, load growth, the retirement of old fossil fuel resources. So this is a real issue. This affordability is affecting people across the U.S. And, VPPs are really being positioned by utilities and regulators as an affordability tool. And you see that come up in actual regulatory filings, in bills that are being introduced. It was a major key issue in the governor's races in New Jersey and in Virginia at the end of last year. In the PSC commissioner races in Georgia, we know that the high price of electricity was a big reason that, two incumbents did not win their seats back. So, this is a real problem that's affecting people, and we're seeing VPPs become part of that solution.
Kevin, I'll have you start on this one, and I maybe take even less joy in this sharing this figure, but we hit double digits on average for Americans for hours that they were out last year. So every American on average was out over 10 hours, some more, some dramatically more, some less, which was the first time that kind of terrible milestone had been achieved. So these figures on, major events causing significant outages on systems, are really making a dent for reliability and resilience outcomes. How do VPPs, plug that hole as well?
Well, I think it's another example of just how well positioned VPPs are to address the challenges that we're facing today. I mean, just transitioning from the question of affordability and how do we get affordable capacity and how do we increase the utilization of the distribution grid, like it solves those problems. The other problem is that, lots of outages for customers. And, well, what are the customers craving right now? Well, the customers are craving backup solutions. Well, guess what? Backup from your vehicle, backup from power walls in your garage. It's something that consumers want. And that's a big opportunity in terms of scaling VPPs and scaling this affordable capacity source for the grid while, solving that need for both the ratepayer customer and the distribution utility as well. The distribution utility wants better outcomes for their customers. The customers obviously want better outcomes. And it's just part of this flywheel that we can get going to be able to serve that ultimate need. And certainly, we have an issue also where some of these large loads are coming into communities and, causing concerns about affordability. And, this is an opportunity. VPPs are an opportunity for those large load customers to potentially provide a benefit back to that community in terms of offering them tools, offering ratepayer customers tools that can help them manage their utility bills and avoid those outages while also creating some of the capacity that they need in order to keep rates low for the entire community.
Madeline, anything else on the resilience picture and the role that VPPs play in there?
Yeah. I mean, just to build on, the example of Puerto Rico that was brought up earlier, you're talking about one of the most, susceptible grids to extreme weather events. And we've talked about just the massive impact that the CBES program has had there. And I think another great example is Green Mountain Power up in Vermont. Their Zero Outages initiative has been deploying residential batteries for years to provide a backup during outages. And, that it is only going to become more common in these areas that are already very susceptible, Vermont, PR, et cetera. We're already seeing a higher adoption rate of those technologies there, as Kevin was saying, for that backup reason. And so, to provide homes with the opportunity to earn additional revenue from devices that they're already choosing to have installed is just a win-win for everyone.
I'll keep this question over with you, Madeline. So at kind of a policy rate making perspective, a little bit less technical than we've been, this VPP solution accrues to a particular part of the system or a particular customer, right? Those that have resources. So which is good because you can target the location that they go in, but how do operators navigate, the allocation of the benefits that are accruing and making sure that, not only the participating customers that have these resources are getting benefit, but to Kevin's conversation earlier, that everybody in a system gets the benefit of the scaling of these assets?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to that point, when the grid does not fail because we have these assets to fall back on, that is a benefit to everybody, whether that resource is in your house or not. But, the reality is that in terms of that compensation right now, it's not differentiated across most programs between a battery that's on a constrained feeder and a battery that's not, or, an aggregation of resources in one area where there's a very constrained feeder and an area where there's not. But we are seeing a shift in thinking toward these more location specific compensation models, to really build out that value stack for those who are providing the most services that are in the end benefiting everyone on the grid. So, a couple of examples of that is providing this distribution level compensation adder for DERs that are on constrained feeders. We see that happening in National Grid with the Connected Solutions Plus program that launched at the end of last year. They're providing up to 125 per kilowatt year additional dollars for batteries that are on constrained feeders. We know that that's offered to a handful of towns, but that's going to grow this year. And that's part of their initiative to really build out that program that, as Kevin mentioned, is one of the longest running battery VPPs in the US. And we saw a similar model take off in Colorado. Xcel just opened their AVPP program that they're also offering an additional incentive for DERs on eligible feeders. So, we're seeing these utilities shift towards this location specific compensation structure to really provide that additional value, because where you are on the distribution grid matters. And as Kevin was saying and Jeff were saying, what makes VPP so unique is that they can provide that distribution level relief that these, front of the meter resources often can't.
Jeff, I'm going to kick this one to you. We're not going to go quite far as back as New York Rev, but old is somewhat new again, with the relevance of these initiatives. It feels like forever ago the FERC 2x4 order hit the market, and I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what it means for everybody. So maybe you can give us a quick update there. I'll call it a quick sidebar. Where do we stand? What needs to still happen with FERC Order 2222?
Well, I think it's sort of I would say, imbalanced sort of process depending on which market you're in. So we're seeing some progress being made in terms of rulemaking, different places like ISO New England and others. But I still think that, we still get questions from utilities asking the same question. What does it mean? How does it change our approach? And most of the utility programs that we operate are still focused on, their own operational cost savings or value. Like, how can they bring direct benefits to their customers using the program? We're not seeing as much market participation or sort of response to different changes in rulemaking. We definitely have started to see things like, state policymakers, starting to get more involved in these sort of things. But I think it's maybe an understatement to say that for 2x4 still nascent, but I definitely think that it's not giving a huge amount of pull through, I think, at least in the programs we're operating, I think, as we would have expected maybe when sort of it initially came out. I think it played a key cultural role in the utility space of normalizing the availability of these assets and giving people this sort of market signal that, hey, you have to take this seriously. But in terms of how it's expressed, I think, again, uneven is maybe the word I would use, and maybe still somewhat nascent in most utility-driven VPPs.
Kevin, anything else on that one?
So much, actually. We're very eager to get VPPs into wholesale markets. We love the transparency of the wholesale markets. We love the trust that participating in the existing constructs brings to VPPs. And accredited capacity right now is the name of the game. It's what's needed out there is more accredited capacity. And the pathway to accredited capacity is participation in these existing constructs. All that said, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of hope for the 2222 constructs as they exist today in all of the RTOs. These tariffs were created at a time when there was a lot of very valid concern about double counting and double compensation, and some very conservative approaches were used to protect against those things. Those are very important issues that need to be solved, that can be solved with some very pragmatic approaches. But unfortunately, the implementations as they exist today are so conservative that they're essentially blockers to bringing behind the meter resources that export to these markets, and it's preventing accredited capacity in some very key markets like PJM, like CAISO, most. And so I'm very eager to work on this policy problem to create this supply side pathway for VPPs to be brought to the capacity market, to be brought to the wholesale markets in order to enable accredited capacity.
Madeline, I'll send this one to you, and then we'll have our wrap-up question here. But to say uncertainty coming from federal agencies is a reality would certainly be an understatement. What kind of impact is this lack of clarity or even maybe active blocking of certain types of resources having, that's coming from federal agencies, having on VPP scaling here in the near to midterm?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super fair question, Bryce. And I mean, the reality is that the absence of federal incentives is going to lead to, a downturn in the adoption of some of these technologies, at least in the short term. But, the long-term drivers still exist. I mean, load growth that is, creating this upward pressure on utility rates. It's driving resiliency concerns at the same time we're seeing more extreme weather events. All of these things are going to continue to cause people to adopt these technologies in their homes, for their own resiliency reasons, for their own cost-cutting reasons. And, having VPPs as an additional part of that value stack only sweetens the pot for people who are making those choices. And, we've seen growth of these programs despite significant uncertainty in the last year. So, in terms of permanently funded programs that are transitioning from that more pilot phase, we've seen on the battery front, an increase to about 55% of residential battery programs across the U.S. are permanently funded. And that's a really exciting change because I think anyone who's been in this space for any amount of time can say that, death by 1,000 pilots, we're all really sick of seeing these. We know what the technology can do and we know that it's out there. So, that is that's a relief to see. I'm not saying it's going to be super easy, but the long-term tailwinds support adoption of this technology, despite that absence of federal incentives.
Let's wrap with this question. Jeff, I'll send it to you first. As the grid continues to scale the aggregation of distributed, often customer-sited resources, what does success look like? How do we get this right?
Well, I think from virtual peaker standpoint, success looks like VPPs regularly dispatching reliably at scale, not just in pilot conditions, but in the middle of all these, heat domes or capacity, anything where utilities take VPPs seriously as a part of operational planning and capital budgeting. I think that sends the market signal that, yes, we believe that this is something that is not just a nice to have, that it is essential and that it is sort of core to our strategy long term.
Kevin?
Well, we can all see that load growth is accelerating, that the need for affordability, that's all accelerating. We need to see an acceleration on policy evolution. There's a lot of work going into it. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit on the VPP side in order to create solutions to address these challenges. And there's a lot happening in the policy sphere right now in order to address all these challenges. And so we need to make sure that VPPs are part of every conversation and that we're knocking down these barriers in order to make sure that VPPs are used as the effective tool that they are as part of an all-of-the-above approach.
And lastly, Madeline.
Yeah, kind of building on that, I think that, in terms of what success would look like, it's more of the devices that are already out there actually a part of these programs. Just to reference back to that 40% number, if we could see double that, 80+% of residential storage or C&I storage enrolled in VPPs, that would be incredible. And having, as Kevin was saying, the, policy that creates funding that would actually incentivize every service that's being provided by that different resource is really valuable. And I mean, the policymakers are starting to recognize that. We're seeing that show up in legislation. We're seeing that show up at the regulatory level, but, having that become more mainstream and just be one more resource that utilities can turn to, as Jeff was saying, it's not just a nice to have, but it's a part of their tool belt.
Madeline, Jeff, Kevin, thank you for being on with us and unpacking this dynamic but very exciting area. We appreciate you illuminating the current situation.
This is important. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Pulse, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.